Chapter 2, The Adolescence of Air Power, the Progress in Europe. So we talked about how progress of aerospace and the air power industry and air industry in the United States developed. So now we're going to take a look and see how the progress happened in Europe. Now we're going to go and we're going to have dates that are going to overlap between the United States and Europe, and we're going to stuff like that. So this again, not linear, is in from the United States now Europe starts. It's kind of there's progress going before the Wrights and progress going during the Wrights and after the Wright brothers and stuff like that. So that's what you're going to find in this one. We're just going to talk about progress in the European area in aviation. So to go on here, we're going to talk about some pioneers to start out here. And the first one in 1904, Robert Esnault Peltre. Okay, and he basically used a Wright style glider, so very similar to the Wright glider, but it was not the Wright glider. And the reason that it was a big thing, and if you take a look at the date here, in 1904, he used ailerons instead of wing warping. Now remember, we talked about that with Glenn Curtiss in the last PowerPoint, and Glenn Curtiss didn't come up with wing warp or ailerons until about 1907-ish. So they had the aileron type of system long before Glenn Curtiss came up with it in the United States. He also worked on having a fully enclosed fuselage, so the body of the airplane fully enclosed. Whereas the Wright Flyer and stuff like that, the pilot and passenger would sit like right on the wing. They had a fuselage and then they enclosed it around the pilot. So then there were sides and stuff like that for the pilot, and it's kind of a box to sit in for the pilot. So this is a very, very big advancement and early on in the aerospace industry, but again, happening in Europe. Again, continuing on, October 23rd in 1906, Alberto Santos Dumont. He was the first to fly a powered airplane in Europe. So keep in mind, even though we just had the previous slide, those planes were not powered planes. They were gliders and stuff like that. Here, this is the first powered airplane in Europe. So he flew that, and it was the 14 Buys biplane. And it looked kind of like this here. I mean, it looked like this. It looked like, basically open-ended boxes for the wings and stuff like that. The pilot spot sits here. And notice, again, an enclosed fuselage. Okay, it still does have two wings, and notice the V shape in the wing type of thing, but it has two wings, one here, and instead of just like the supports like the Wright Flyer and stuff like that they had full sides involved in that 14 Buys biplane. Okay, and then 2 weeks after this date, he flew a flight of 722 feet. Okay, now that's quite a feat. And again, 1906 we're looking at, and here was one of the big differences between the European aviation and American aviation, United States aviation, is this flight was reported so favorably by the press that everybody knew about it. All of Europe was excited about the news, and they thought it was great. This is cool stuff. So Europe, the general population of Europe, was excited about aviation because it was reported favorably by the press. Very, very much different than that in the United States. We come to a name that you are familiar with from the last PowerPoint. Okay, and in 1907, Louis Blériot. Okay, so this is that Blériot plane that the Harriet Quimby flew and stuff like that. So Louis Blériot, he built and flew the world's first powered monoplane. So remember that picture of the plane that I had in the last PowerPoint with Harriet Quimby flying in the monoplane, a single-wing airplane. So he built and flew that first one. Remember, it was an unstable plane, unbalanced and stuff like that, but he flew it, and he created it too. And in 1909, Here's the English Channel crossing again. Okay, the English Channel. He was the first person to fly across the English Channel. Okay, so when they went from in the with the hot air balloon, they flew from Dover to Calais. Well, Blériot flew from Calais to Dover. Okay, so same places roughly, just different direction. Okay, and he flew in a Blériot 11, and this picture of the Blériot 11 looked very similar to how Harriet Quimby's plane looked. More this one's a little bit smaller setup, doesn't look as bulky and big in the front, but has a very similar style to it. Now, throughout the course of attempting the flight across the English Channel, Blériot went through about 11 iterations or 11 different versions of this plane before he decided on this is the one that's going to be able to make this trip. Okay, so that's why the name of this one is the Blériot 11. Okay, during his time making these planes and test flying these planes and coming up with the perfect plane for this trip, he had approximately about 50 crashes coming into this. Okay, so he cracked up the plane quite a bit. And again, like I said before, he went from Calais, France, to Dover, England, as opposed to when they flew with a hot air balloon, they flew from Dover to Calais. This is about a 25-mile trip that he had. Okay, and here's the interesting thing: he had no compass for his trip. Okay, he didn't bring a compass along on this trip to know where he was going, the direction he was going, which proved to be a difficult for him because after about 10 minutes of flight, he got lost. He couldn't find out where he was going. Now, during normal flights, during normal places, you can look at landmarks, you can find things on ground that you can identify, roads, rivers, tree lines, towns, whatever it may be. You can see those things on land. When you're crossing a body of water, that's all you see is water. So there's no landmarks or nothing to find your way if you're going the right direction or not. So he just continued flying because he didn't know which way to go. So he continued on flying. After a while of flying, his engine started to overheat. So now he's lost, doesn't know where he is. His engine is starting to heat or overheat, and he's starting to now look in the English Channel and trying to find ships that are going through the English Channel that he can possibly crash land by so they can fish him out of the water, things like that. And he's not having any luck even finding any ships down there. And so what he sees is he sees a storm coming. So again, lost, engine overheating, and then he sees rain and a storm coming. But what he does, instead of avoid the rain and storm, he flies into the rain shower, figuring that the rain shower will cool down the engine, which it did. It did actually cool down the engine. And finally, he was able to find Dover or find the area where he was supposed to be going. In Dover, England, you may have always heard the terminology about the White Cliffs of Dover. Well, he found the White Cliffs of Dover and found that it was about a 37-minute flight. He landed in Dover, a very rough landing, kind of cracked up the airplane a little bit, but it was a very rough landing, but he did make it. So he made it from Calais to Dover in about 37 minutes, and he had some issues along the way, but he did it. He was the first to fly across the English Channel, and that was Louis Blériot. As we continue on to pioneers, this is not necessarily a pioneer, but it's an interesting spot in history. August 22nd through 29th, 1909. So we're, again, 7 years after the Wright brothers have their airplane and stuff like that. Well, they're holding in France, Reims, France, the first international air meet. So they're bringing all these airplanes coming in because airplanes all become popular, and they're bringing all these airplanes in. They're going to have an air meet. They're going if you've ever heard of the Oshkosh Air Show in Wisconsin. It's a big air meet where all the planes come in, they park, people can watch, see them, and look at them, watch them fly, hear stories about them, and there's all kinds of stuff that you can buy and sell there, things like that. And it's kind of basically what this was going to be. They had brought in about 36 airplanes. People brought in about 36 airplanes came in. So for the first one, that's quite a few airplanes that come in and do that. So these planes fly around and trying to do things. They're trying to maybe set world records and doing stuff like that. Well, throughout the time, there's been some crashes throughout the week. However, no one was seriously hurt or killed, which is always good. However, several records were broken during this time, and it's obvious. I mean, the plane's only been around 6 or 7 years, so the records are not too many records, and the records probably aren't that great, so they can probably be fairly easily broken. So records are being broken. One of the records that was broken was the endurance record. In other words, how long the airplane was in the air. And it was broken by Henry Farman. Okay, and he stayed in the air for 3 hours, 4 minutes, and 56 seconds. And more than likely, that was because he probably ran out of gas and he had to land. Okay, but now you think about it: 3 hours, 4 minutes, 50 seconds. That's a short airplane ride when you're traveling from one place to another nowadays commercially. That's a fairly short airplane ride. Some airplane rides are upwards of 6, 7 hours. So, but that was the endurance record for staying in the air at that point in time in 1909. They also had a fastest lap record broken, which was broken by Louis Blériot, and he did the fastest lap in 47.8 miles per hour. So he was moving pretty decently with his, and I'm sure it was one of his Blériot monoplanes that he had created. I'm not sure if it was the 11 or not, but it was one of his planes, I'm sure. Also unveiled was the first multi-engine aircraft. So up to this point, all aircraft had one motor, one propeller, one engine type of thing. So now we get to see a multi-engine aircraft where we have more than one motor, more than one propeller. Okay. The idea behind a multi-engine aircraft is to increase the power. Okay. 2 motors, 2 propellers will bring up twice the power. Okay. And the concept behind that, when you have twice the power, you have also improve your reliability and safety, because if one motor goes out, you still have another motor that works, and so on and so forth. Some of the disadvantages, or a couple of disadvantages, is the fact that 2 motors, 2 propellers, twice the weight. Okay, and if one does have a problem, will the single motor keep the other one, or keep the airplane in the air? So there are also some disadvantages to a multi-engine aircraft. So to continue on with some multi-engine aircraft development, in 1911, there were the Short brothers. We had Horace, Eustace, and Oswald, and they created they had the first multi-engine aircraft. Okay, and it was called the Triple Twin. Okay, the Triple Twin. And that they called it that because they had 2 engines and 3 propellers. And if you take a look at this here, you have an engine right up here in front, and you can see the belt coming out here to this propeller, and you can see the belt coming out here to this propeller. So we had one engine running the 2 propellers in front. Then you can see a propeller right here in the back, and there's an engine back there. So you had one engine running that propeller. So you had 2 polar propellers and 1 pusher propeller. So you had 2 props in the front, 1 in the rear. Okay, and so that was why they called it the Triple Twin: 3 props, 2 engines, and that was their multi-engine aircraft that they had run. Okay, and again, part of the interesting thing with this is you now have 2 engines, but you're still using 3 props. So you're not tripling the weight. You're only doubling the weight if it were just 1 engine. So that's a That was probably what their thought process was behind this, was let's lessen the weight by using uh, two props on one motor instead. We have another multi-engine um, plane coming up, and you may have recognized the last name of this person from some of the things you may have read or heard about. But May 13th, 1913, Igor Sikorsky. Now, Sikorsky, you may recognize the name, you may not. But right now, Sikorsky is a very prominent name in the helicopter industry. Okay, the Sikorsky helicopters are a very popular helicopter, especially in the European area, more so towards the Russian area in Europe. Okay, but he came out in 1913 here with the first four-engine airplane. Okay, so this airplane had a 92-foot wingspan. Okay, so 92 foot from tip to tip on here. He had four 100 horsepower engines. And if you look closely, you can see a prop right here. There's an engine. You can see a prop right here to be an engine. And then there's two more on this side. So you had four 100 horsepower engines. Okay. He had a 16-wheeled landing gear. There are a lot of wheels under here, probably more than what's on a 747 today. And these are probably even bigger wheels than that. But he had 16-wheel landing gear. Fully enclosed cockpit. So the pilot sat in here, and you can see totally enclosed, glass encased up here. Very good view with the glass all the way around. Okay. They had a passenger cabin, and it's kind of tough to see, but the passenger cabin is back here. Okay. And they used actually portholes, very similar to what you would see on like the side of a ship, the little circular hole that you could open and close. That was what they used for the passenger cabin windows, portals. And then this plane here was the first four-engine airplane. It was called the Legrand, and basically this airplane was really kind of the lead airplane in how commercial airliners started to develop themselves. When you start looking at that, multi-engine passenger cabins, big wingspans, and everything enclosed. So it made the beginnings of air travel and heavier than air really close to a possibility at this point. As we get going here, we have go back to 1907, and there's the Seguin brothers. Okay, and the Seguin brothers, they came up with an interesting concept to an airplane. Okay, they created an air-cooled rotary engine. Okay, now just to give you an explanation, all engines to this point were water-cooled. Okay, so similar to like the car that might be in your garage or something like that, it has a radiator in it. It has a water coolant. They call it antifreeze in the car because in Minnesota we don't want our water to freeze in the wintertime. So we put antifreeze in it so it doesn't freeze, stays liquid. But what it does, as the car travels forward, air blows through that front grill into the radiator, cooling the water inside. The water flows through and flows around the engine, keeping the engine cool. Okay, keeping the engine cool. And as it goes through around the engine, it comes back and goes back into the radiator and recools itself, and it just keeps recycling back and forth. Very similar to how a airplane worked at that time. It had a radiator, air flow through, and then just get going through the engine and cooling the engine down. They wanted an air-cooled rotary engine because when you stop and think about it, if you don't have the water and the radiator and all that extra weight, that's going to make an engine much lighter. So we're working on an air-cooled rotary engine. So this rotary engine was so much lighter, it was 7 pounds lighter than a water-cooled engine per horsepower. Okay, so if you had a 10 horsepower engine, it was 7 pounds per horsepower lighter. So it was 70 pounds lighter than what a water cooled engine would be. Okay, that's a lot of horsepower. Okay, that's a lot of weight. So if you could lighten a engine that much, put that engine on an airplane, and the airplane and the engine be still just as powerful, you could actually add a lot of other features to your airplane that you could have to make your airplane be more reliable and stuff like that. So the way they came up with this was a crankshaft that was fastened to the airframe. So what they did is, the weird thing with this is, and I got a couple of videos I'm going to show you here, is the airframe, or the crankshaft is fast to the airframe. So that not only did the propeller spin, but the motor itself spun also, as opposed to a water-cooled engine where just the propeller spins. Okay, so the next slide, I got a couple of videos I just want to show you. Okay, and this video right here is the rotary engine, and you're going to notice when they start this engine here, the pistons, which are these things, this is all going to spin around. Okay, so I'm just going to play this for you. I thought I was going to play it for you. There we go. So notice, that motor is actually spinning back there. Okay. Now this one here is a water-cooled engine. It's a much bigger engine because you can see it's sitting on a truck here and stuff like that. And it's probably a much more modern water-cooled engine, but it's still a water-cooled engine, prop engine, that you have the radiator that will have its air is forced through the radiator and cooling the water in here. But you can see how this one, just the prop spins and not the motor. And hopefully this one will start a little bit quicker than the other one. There we go. And now watch, this one he doesn't have to hand crank it. It has an electric crank, and you can hear it starting up. That circle there, that's not part of the engine. But if you notice, just you can see this is not turning, just the prop is turning. So that's the difference between a rotary engine and a water-cooled engine. They're both cylinder, they're both circular engines. Okay, they're called both radial engines because all the pistons are around a radius. Okay, but one is water cooled and the other one was air cooled. Okay, so that just kind of gives you an idea of what the brothers did over here, as opposed to what was generally in the movie. Okay, a couple other things that we have is we have some vertical flying that was going on. So keep in mind that balloons and other things were still around, dirigibles, and they were experimenting with some vertical takeoff also. And they were basically working on what we call the modern day helicopter, which you're very, very familiar with. Okay. But their problem is okay, it's not like a plane. And so we got to produce lift differently. So in an airplane, a wing moving forward through the air creates the lift for the airplane. So the air flows over differently, and you have lift created for the airplane. And so you have to have that forward motion in an airplane. Well, if you're not going to have forward motion right away in a helicopter, you have vertical motion, in other words, straight up and down motion. That means that the lift has to be produced by the wing or the rotors of the helicopter itself. So the big top rotor are nothing more than wings that they spin on a helicopter. In essence, is what it is in order for it to lift up off the ground. Okay. So we had, and then now not all this stuff happened in Europe here. This is kind of throughout the world now. But we had Roger Bacon, Leonardo da Vinci, and George Cayley all had experimented with ideas of helicopter. Remember, we talked about the helical screw back in chapter 1 from Da Vinci and stuff like that. And but none of them went further than models and or anything like that. So they start, but they had the concepts, the ideas were there. In 1842, W.H. Phillips, he created a steam jet air tips. Okay, so he had steam jets on the tips of a rotor that made the rotor go round. Okay, and that created lift because it would go around fast enough. And he created a model of that. Okay, and so that was kind of the first practical experiment or practical type of thing that semi worked. So that produced more interest and more intrigue in this area. And in 1907, Louis Rigaud, okay, he actually rode in the first helicopter to lift a person, and that helicopter was steadied by 4 assistants. So he sat in some type of seat of some sort, and he had some type of rotors above him going around, and it lifted him off, and then 4 assistants steadied it so he wouldn't fall over, fall off, or whatever like that. So, so that's how the first person to be lifted in the helicopter was Louis Rigaud. Okay. Then we have in 1909 Emil and Henry Berliner. Okay, they were the first Americans to build and fly a helicopter. And what they had to do was they had to come up with helicopter control, and they had to overcome the torque of the rotor blade. So what that means is if you have a blade, or you have think of a helicopter now, and you have the rotor spinning on the top, okay, and that thing starts to spin faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. As it goes, what would the rest of the helicopter actually want to do underneath it? Okay, that helicopter eventually underneath it, or the body underneath it, would eventually want to spin in the same direction that the rotor is spinning. It would want to be pulled in that same direction. So they had to overcome this torque because you don't want to be sitting in the seat spinning around. You're going to get really sick really quickly. Okay, so one of the solutions, or one of their thoughts, was to put 2 rotors in opposite directions. So you got your helicopter here, the motor, you can see that here, wheels, there's a seat, okay? And you can see you got 1 rotor here and 1 rotor here. So what I was saying before, if we only have 1 rotor and that was spinning in one direction, all of this would want to spin in that same direction. So now what they do is put in 2 of them on here. They spin this one clockwise and spin this one counterclockwise. This one counteracts the torque from this one. This one counteracts the torque from that one, and they stay steady. This part of it stays steady and stays stable. Okay. And I don't have a picture of it, but you can look it up at some point. But there's a helicopter that the military uses today. It's called a Chinook helicopter, and it has this double rotor concept, except one rotor is on the front part of the helicopter, the other rotor is on the back part of the helicopter. Okay, so it's not one above the other, it's one's on the front, one's on the back. So, and it does the same purpose. This one spins one way, that one spins the other way, preventing the helicopter from just spinning underneath. Okay. Then we have the more helicopter that most people are familiar with, which is the big rotor on the top and then a small vertical rotor or propeller, did you want to hear, on a tail boom. And this is the helicopters that are the most common, okay, because it takes less material and things like that. You got just a small rotor here, and they're probably a little bit easier to fly because of the fact you don't have to worry about two rotors above you. And again, what this does is, as this is spinning one direction, this will want to spin. It'll want to spin the helicopter that direction also. But this prop here pushes the helicopter in the opposite direction that the rotor wants it to spin, thus keeping it stable. So this is a small prop at the end of the boom, and this is kind of the predecessor to kind of how a modern day helicopter looks like today. Okay, so that's kind of some vertical flight stuff. We get into some other types of things like the beginning of commercial flying. Okay, in the beginning of commercial flying, it happened January 1st, 1914, and that was the world's first regular scheduled airline service. Okay, and this was using a heavier than air aircraft, because remember, they had airline services, they had passenger services with dirigibles before. Okay, and around this time, this is the first one with heavier than air aircraft. Okay, this happened in the United States. Okay, it was St. Petersburg to Tampa, or St. Petersburg Tampa airboat line. So that was, so it was in the Florida area, and it was across the Tampa Bay. So it wasn't like it was going across the ocean; it was going across the bay in Tampa. And it was Tony Janis was the pilot and the owner of this St. Petersburg Tampa airboat line. He flew a twin-engine Vinoy 14 flying boat, and you can see that. Okay, so we got the twin wing. It's a pusher prop here, and you got no wheels here because this is going to land on the water. So it has a boat shape here. Okay, it had a boat shape here, and then passengers sat over in here somewhere. Okay, it would be a 2-passenger flight. The flight was 22 miles. It took about 20 minutes to do this route, and it was flown twice a day. So now you can see, okay, it was a regular schedule because it was twice a day. It was a service because it carried passengers, and it also charged people $5 per trip. Okay, $5 per trip. In 1914, $5 was probably the equivalent of maybe a $50 ticket now or something of that nature. So it was something, again, not everybody was using. Only people that had some wealth to them probably would use this particular type of transportation. So as we get going through here, now we got commercial flying. We're getting to, you take a look at the date on here, we got 1914. We're getting close to a major event in world history right now, and that is World War One. Okay, and so here's kind of a lead up to World War One here, because that's going to be our next PowerPoint, is just based on World War One. So this is kind of preparing for that right now. So in 1912, okay, so this is, we're looking at 9 years or so after the Wright brothers' first flight, after really the first practical powered flight. Okay, so about 9 years, there's a lot of the major modern countries that formed a military flying service. Okay, so you had a country that formed their type of Air Corps, air service in their military. Okay, the United States had one, but it was present in name only. Okay, it was present in name only. Yes, we had the United States Air Corps. Okay, or the United States Military Air Service, or whatever it was called at that time. The problem is because in the United States there was almost no progress in military aviation. Okay, remember back in the last slide presentation that the Wright brothers finally convinced the United States government to buy an airplane from them, and they bought that one airplane. Okay, the Wright airplane purchased in 1908 was the only airplane in the U.S. military until 1911. Okay, so the United States Military Air Service consisted of one Wright flyer. Okay, and then in 1911, they thought, you know what, we need to enhance our military aviation service. So Congress said we got to go. We got to go and get more planes. We need more planes. So they went out and purchased 5 more. So they were going to really go all out and get a whole bunch of planes. Okay, a whole bunch of planes. Well, by the end of 1913, the United States had 19 airplanes and 29 trained pilots. Okay, 19 airplanes and 29 trained pilots. That was the existence, or the what existed for the United States Military Air Corps. Okay, that was their Air Corps. In 1914, World War I started. Okay, at the beginning of World War I, Germany, okay, Germany, who is on the Central Powers, one of their main nations, they had 200 aircraft. The United States had 19. Okay, Britain, one of the allies, okay, had about 450 aircraft. The United States had 19. France had about 450 aircraft also. The United States had 19. As you can see, where we kind of started talking about the progress of aviation in the United States with not that big of a deal. It wasn't received very well by the Wright brothers and stuff like that. You can see that this is starting to look like the United States isn't thinking ahead. Okay, and they're now looking at 1914. Now, keep in mind, the United States wants to remain neutral in this war, so they're not jumping into this war. But you can't go into looking at this and saying we're ready if we have to. Okay, with you got 1,100 aircraft just out of 3 countries in the Europe, and we have a grand total of 19. Okay, so this is kind of how you started looking at World War I and what was going to happen over there. Okay, well, 3 years later, in 1917, America entered the war. Now you saw the war started in 1914. We have 19 aircraft. Germany has 200. The other, France and Britain each have 450. The United States says, you know what? We got to throw our gear into. We got to throw production. We got to get going. If we happen to get pulled into this war, we got to be ready. Okay. In 1917, when America entered the war, we did not have one single combat-worthy airplane. We had 19, just none of them were combat-worthy. None of them would be able to take in combat. The only actual aircraft company in the United States that could even be considered to make combat-worthy aircraft was Curtiss Aircraft Industry. Okay, and they were the only one considered. So at this point in time, Congress said, you know what, we really got to get going. We really got to work on this. So Congress approved $64 million for the construction of aircraft. Okay, and Congress boasted. They said, we are going to darken the skies over Europe with United States aircraft. Okay, they are going to make so many airplanes that when they get over there, they're just going to be so many over there that we're just going to rule the skies. Okay, that promise led to, or they were promising 263 American squadrons with 22,625 airplanes by June of 1918. Okay, so within a year, they were going to have 22,000, almost 23,000 aircraft. Okay, now keep in mind that's June of 1918. World War I ended November of 1918. Okay, so it ended only a few months later. And by the end of the war in November 1918, America had 45 American squadrons in action, not 263, 45. Okay, and of all those squadrons, of the 45 squadrons that the United States had, all were flying British or French aircraft. They were flying the British planes or they were flying the French planes. Not one single American designed aircraft ever saw war in World War One because they never made 22,000 aircraft. Okay, the only aircraft that were made during this time ended up being trainer planes in the United States. Curtis Jennies were basically the main plane, and those were the planes that uh, were training the pilots so they could fly the British and French aircraft. So that's kind of the short-sightedness of the United States. They didn't want to cover. They didn't cover very well the flights of the Wright brothers. The government didn't want to really buy any airplanes from the Wright brothers. There was no push to enhance aviation. And now entering a war that aviation becomes a major part of, and which we'll talk about in the next PowerPoint, how much of a part of the war it became. But it became such a point that we didn't even have any airplanes in the war at all. Okay, a war that we were in. So it shows some short-sightedness of the United States. This is not the only time in history that you're going to see short-sightedness about aviation in the future of the United States. You're going to see short-sightedness come down the way a few more times down the path. So that is basically European progress and some other stuff in leading up to World War One. The next slideshow will be talking just strictly about World War One and aviation in World War One.